Jerry, the flight teams in Houston were divided into colors. Can you please explain to us what the background is or was, and why your team was the gold team?
Yeah, it's got another funny story with it.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh,
um,
nice.
the first three flight directors, well, let me back up a little bit. The first flight director for Mercury, the only flight director, was Chris Kraft. He didn't have a color. He was just called Flight. That was him. Uh, the In Gemini, he started out kind of trying to do it by himself, and he realized he couldn't do it all. And Chris Kraft was our mentor, all of us that were in that era of flight control. And Chris brought on Gene Kranz and and uh, and Glenn Lunny and a fellow named Cliff Charlesworth uh, to have it. And he got out of the flight directing business, kind of stepped aside after a while during the Gemini program. But they decided to go with the three teams that they started with. I'm sorry, there was a guy named John Hodge in there, and that was the third guy he brought on first before he brought on Cliff and Glenn. But anyway, it was him, Gene Kranz, John Hodge, and they decided to use red, white, and blue. Very American, very patriotic colors. So then he got out of the flight directing business and turned it over to Kranz. Hodge left to go to headquarters. So that left Kranz, and he brought on Lunny and Charlesworth. And Lunny chose black. I don't know why. Charlesworth chose green. So we had white, that was Kranz, black, that was Lunny, and then we had Charlesworth, who was green. Well, we got to the fire, the point of the Apollo 1 fire. And after the fire, Kraft decided he needed 3 more flight directors. And he wanted to go into the Apollo program with 6, which is what we had throughout the rest of the program. So in those days, it was very easy because Kraft made that decision. He reached down and plucked me out of the crowd, and he picked a guy named Pete Frank, and he picked a guy named Milt Wendler. Well, now we had to pick our team color, and we use those colors for ease. We would just say gold team is going to do this, white team's going to do this on any mission, or even during a mission. If we change things around, we're going to move the gold team to do this. And it was just an easy way to say it. I went to Texas A&M, which, much like this shirt, is maroon. So everybody thought I had the first pick, and everybody thought I would pick maroon. But I didn't. And the reason is that during the recovery from the fire, I spent a lot of time in Downey, California, where the command and service module were built. And in trying to get everything flammable, all of that out of there, improve the spacecraft, both the service module and the command module that were put together. And I flew on Continental Airline most of the time, and it had a golden tail. And their advertisement at that time is United now, part of United, but their advertisement is the proud bird with the golden tail. Well, all the flight controllers that I had worked with down in the trenches got to calling me the proud bird with the golden tail. So when I was named flight director, I was going to pick maroon, but all of these guys descended on me and said, "You got to be gold because you're the golden one, the proud bird with the golden tail." So I picked gold. Well, guess who got maroon? Milt Wendler. He went to Virginia Tech, and they were maroon and gold. But so he got the maroon, I got the gold out of Virginia. But anyway, that's how I got there. And Pete Frank the other third one picked orange. And guess where he went? He went to the University of Texas, which is orange and white. So all of those made sense. Now they're up to, I heard just this week, they were up to 101, I believe, flight directors. They had to get away from colors. And they finally went to things like, pewter and names of Sirius, the star. They ran out of colors to use. So anyway, that's how I got there. That's a long answer, but it kind of had that funny twist at the end.
Yeah, really cool story. And this is we don't find on Wikipedia. So this is the best decision to make an interview with you.
It does. Tony, let me say one thing. I think those kind of stories make it real, make it human.
Oh, yes.
That we weren't, and we sometimes we're portrayed as being NASA, and we made a mistake. We weren't perfect. And the human side of that story, I think, is very important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Jerry, your goal team was in charge of the Apollo 12 and 15 launches. Apollo 12 had the 2 lightning strikes on the Saturn V, and John Aaron's Tri-SCE-2 auxiliary is well known. 2 questions. Was there ever a moment where you thought that you have to call an abort? And did you thank John Aaron, especially afterwards?
Yeah. On both questions. The answer is yes. The way that happened, it was so fast after launch. It was, I think the first strike was about 35 seconds. And so we were still at, low altitude and accelerating, but we were at low altitude. We had a plot on the front wall that was, let me tell you what it is. It's V gamma, it's velocity versus flight path angle, which you don't have to keep up with. But it looks like a trajectory. Let me point it out. It looked like it was going just like this. And there was a pre-planned line on there that it should follow. And the first thing I looked at, and this was about a nanosecond after our data in the control center froze. We didn't have any data that made any sense. And Pete Conrad, the commander, was reading off master caution and warning lights, one after the other. And he was telling us their lights had dimmed down to almost nothing in the cockpit. But the first thing I looked at was the trajectory. Were we gaining altitude? Because in this all millisecond kind of stuff, that if we were going to abort, all of us wanted to get more altitude, so that if they had to use the escape tower, they had more altitude for the parachutes to work to let them down in the water. And on the launch escape tower was rough. It was a rough ride. And so it's something you don't want to do if you don't have to. And it's something that if you have to do it, wait as long as you can, get some altitude, so you can recover from the roughness and let it all settle down and get parachutes. And now the reason it was still on course was because the Saturn computer was controlling the flight. We were back up. The command module system was about, the commander could take control and steer it himself. But we didn't have to do that because for some reason, which we'll never know because it's the way lightning works, it didn't affect the Saturn computer. It's called the instrument unit, but it was a computer. And it was going right up the trajectory just fine. So don't do anything quick. That was my thought. And when John Aaron came up with Tri-SCE to aux, I'd never heard of the switch. Neither had the Capcom, neither had Pete Conrad. Capcom was Jerry Carr. John turned around. He was one row down was looking right at me and said, "Flight, have him try SCE to aux." And I kind of gave him but I trusted him completely. So I told Carr, I said, "Carr, tell him SCE to aux." And he called it up, and Pete's answer was, "Roger, NCE to aux." And then he said, "What the hell is that?" And but thank goodness, and then Jerry Carr repeated it, SCE. It is SCE to aux, and auxiliary, he said. And Al Bean knew where it was. It switched right in front of me. When he went from normal to auxiliary, we got a new set of electronics handling the measurement system, the electronic measurement system. We got data back immediately. They got some of the caution warning went off, but they were still dim light. And immediately, as soon as John Aaron got data, the most important thing maybe that he did after SCE to aux, he said, "Tell him to reset the fuel cells." The fuel cells, we had 3 of them. You put oxygen and hydrogen together, and it produces power and water. But they had been knocked off the line, if you will. It's like a lightning strike at your home where your circuit breakers blow and you don't have power. And eventually you can restore it by resetting circuit breakers and getting power back on and all that. They reset the fuel cells, and when they did, everything came back up. They had all their master caution and warning went out. It was dim, nothing there. The lights came back up to a higher level. We were still plowing uphill, going to headed to space. And from then on, it was kind of cleaning up. The last thing we had to do, and we were still under powered flights, still getting to orbit. Conrad called down. We knew it already, but he said, "Gang, we've lost the platform, the inertial measurement unit." But he said, "We can take care of that when we get to orbit." And indeed, we did. When we got to orbit, Dick Gordon got down in the lower bay and did a realign using the sextant, and it worked just fine. So by the time we were ready for a TLI decision, that was probably the hardest, and we had more time to think about it. Should we go on to the moon or should we come home? The reason is that we didn't know what the lightning had done to the heat shield. We didn't know what it had done to the pyrotechnics that fire the parachutes out to get rid of panels that have to go and all that. So we weren't, but we had that to do anyway. We had a re-entry to do because we were now in orbit. Time to think about it. So we did a series of checks. We did exactly the checks in Earth orbit that we would have done when we went to lunar orbit in order to fire the engine, the service propulsion engine that we needed to get into lunar orbit. We checked all that out. It worked. It looked fine. And then made the decision to go on. That was probably one of the bigger decisions I made in the business of being a flight director. And of course, I didn't make it by myself. I had a lot of input, and ideas, and thoughts, and you got to sift through them and make the final decision because the flight director does that. But we had the whole program working in that orbit and a half, and we actually went on to the moon. You know, that was after that. Apollo 12 was probably the cleanest mission we had ever.
Wow.
We had very, very few minor failures after that. One of them, another human story, Al Bean inadvertently pointed the TV camera on the moon at the sun, and it couldn't handle it. They fixed that later on where it wouldn't happen. But I never let him forget about it because he went to the University of Texas too, which was a rival university of Texas A&M. And I said, you know, those Texas Longhorns just can't get it right. But anyway, we had a lot of fun with that one over the years, and so and boy, you talk about a great guy. Al Bean was just wonderful.
Wow.
Well, let's go back quickly to one situation. You talked about the IMU resetting, because for me it means a big explanation for the structures of mission control. You had your GNC not being very quick in deciding what to do, and you, as a former GNC, knew what to do, but you waited. How difficult was that, to let him make the decision instead of making it for him, and sticking to the rules, to let the decision be made on the lower level?
One of the things about the Apollo program that made it so successful was the method. Let me call it method or theme, the way we worked. We trusted the people below us, and that was true throughout the agency. That was true. We pushed decisions down in that era to the level where the people that really knew the subject matter resided. We trusted the people above us as well in all those areas. Our leadership was so good that they trusted us to do the right thing, and we trusted them we wanted to do well for them because they trusted us and we trusted their decision making. They would occasionally make an input mostly before the flight, not during the flight. They knew the experts were in mission control and all of those back rooms in the program office that were all assembled. We had contractors back at their plants that built the spacecraft that we could call upon to run simulations for us and that sort of thing. So it was this giant pyramid that worked so well, and it was based on trust. And one of the things that Chris Kraft, he instilled in all of us, if you've got somebody below you that can't perform, don't try to do it for him. What you just said, don't try to do it for him. If he's not doing the work, replace him. And if you can't trust him to make the right call. So particularly in a time-critical situation like Apollo 12, and John Aaron I always thought was great. He made the decision, and he based that on something that very rare. He had watched a test that was done on the pad. The control center wasn't even involved in it well before the flight. And they had a similar thing. It was another spacecraft. But they had a similar thing where they lost data and they went SCE. The technician at the Cape said something like, just flip that switch down to the auxiliary position. And when it did, they got their data back. So there was a case where a young man was monitoring a test he didn't have to monitor. He had done that on his own. And so that's why you trusted people like John Aaron. If they tell you something, you can take it to the bank. I didn't have time to ask him what the SCE aux was. And neither did Jerry Carr, and neither did Pete Conrad. We just had to act on it. And Al Bean knew every switch in front of him. So and the other thing was, I was a GNC, a guidance, navigation, and control systems guy before I became a flight director. John was an ECOM, electrical, environmental, and communication. So John I knew a lot about the ECOM systems because you had to as a flight director generally. But I didn't know the depth of it like John did. That was another reason. That was another reason to trust him and don't try to make a call yourself. He knew a heck of a lot more about it than I did. So that trust. And let me say one final thing, and it's true on that. It's true in Germany. It's true here. as organizations grow older, as they mature, that decisions start getting pulled up higher and higher and higher in the organization. It's because some of those people transition to higher levels and they take their responsibilities with them. Part of it is just the aging and the public look, and it happens in companies, where public companies particularly, where shareholders have more and more visibility into what they're doing. And so there's more pressure to, why don't you make that decision at headquarters instead of making it down here below somewhere else, and where the knowledge lies. And so this happened. It's happened to NASA to a degree, that there's more and more decisions made at the headquarters level that we used to make, well down into the center organization. And it's just you got to watch it carefully. It's an age problem. It's a growing problem. And boy, in Apollo era, we didn't have that at all. Everybody had their responsibilities, and they were trusted to make the right call.
Yeah, but I'm in the situation where Buck Willoughby didn't come back with pulling the circuit breakers, and you had to wait and wait. Wasn't that difficult?
It was very difficult. On Apollo 12, you're talking about the lightning strike. I told you we lost the platform. Well, when we lost it, it was tumbling. This is a electromechanical device. And I knew from my GNC days that you could pull the circuit breaker on that inertial measurement unit, and it would stop it. It would cage it, and you wouldn't do any damage to the gimbals that were inside. And I kept asking the GNC, don't you want to pull it? You've heard it probably. Don't you want to pull the circuit breaker on the IMU? He'd say standby flight, and he gave me standby flight about 3 times. The third time, I said, "You best hurry," because we were getting on, and the G loads were getting higher and higher. So anyway, yeah, that was hard not to make that call myself, but I didn't. He finally said, "Yeah, flight, have him pull me IMU circuit breaker," and I said, "Oh, thank goodness."
Nice. Okay, let's dive in a little bit into Apollo 17.
Okay.
You and your team monitored Apollo 14, 16, and 17, the half of all lunar landings.
That's right.
Was there a specific reason why the Gold team was so often in charge during the landings?
There was. As we got toward the end of the program, we have moved teams around to different phases of the mission and let them do simulations prior to that mission to become familiar with exactly what was going on. And of course, that took more simulations. It took more time. But we wanted to spread the wealth around, if you will, using a slang. We wanted all the teams to run as many of those phases as we could, to learn as much as we could, to take on to the future. When we knew the program was going to end, when we were getting toward the end, and we already had people getting pulled off to do Skylab and to do ASTP. Glenn Lunny left after Apollo 15 to be the head of the ASTP program, the Apollo Soyuz. And so we already had people starting to get pulled away, and even had some early shuttle work going on. We decided it'd be best not to try to keep doing that, but to reuse teams that were familiar with those phases of the mission. Well, I had done the landing supposed to do it on 13, had done all those simulations, then did all the simulations for 14 and performed the landing. We let Lunny run the landing actually on 15 because he was departing and he never had done one. So we said, okay. And then we got back to 16 and 17, and and my team came back on because we had already done 2, and we went into simulation for 16 right away after 15. And I was the lead flight director for 15, but it was the only time the lead flight director didn't go on to do that lunar landing. So 16 and 17, we did that because it was less training required. My team was really comfortable with doing. Funny part, we had a big problem on 16. We almost didn't land, but because of a problem in the command service module, which we figured out a workaround. But it never got routine. It never was a routine thing. But my team had done so many landings in simulations, and then the actual on 14, that it made sense after we got Lonnie taken care of. Made sense to come back and put our team on. And it made a difference. We didn't have to, we ran a bunch of simulations, but it was more just looking at the nuance differences between landing at Descartes on Apollo 16 and landing at Taurus Littrow. Different terrain, different things to look for and do scientifically. We spent a lot more time on the science on 15, 16, and 17. When we got the rover, I know I've mentioned this before in several interviews, that we really did switch from let's get them up there and back and get what science we can to never taking the eye off the safety issues or anything, but now we can really, let's work on what we're going there for, and that was the science. And we all got familiar with a lot more familiar with what they did on the surface of the moon and how they did it. I went, and Kranz went. Several people went on field trips with them in those later missions. Went with field trips on Earth to like places that they were going to land on the moon and to train, and walked right beside them while they were doing all that. It really made the science feel real then on the moon, rather than being kind of, go get rocks. And it made sense of what we were doing. And the same thing will have to happen in Artemis. The first flights, will be very much get them up and get them back, get what science we can. And later on, it'll develop more into an exploration feel to it. And that's another part of the human aspect of it, is switching that from a research and development, kind of a development mode, into, I call it operational. Spaceflight is hard to call operational. Maybe to low Earth orbit it can be, but to the lunar area and beyond, deep space is tough. And 17 put a cap on that I thought was really important, because 17 we had a geologist, Jack Schmitt, on the surface of the moon, and with Gene Cernan, the science return was vast. It was very, very good, not only in just pounds of material brought back, but their interpretation, particularly Jack's interpretation of what he was seeing on the moon. Still talked about. So the lunar geologist, lunar, we got to figure out another word. Geology is geo, is Earth. And to call it lunar geology ain't right. It's not right. We got to call it lunar science or lunarology or something. Well, anyway, 17 really put a nice cap on understanding what we were doing all this for. Now it's been 50 years, so we're going to have to kind of rebuild that again. But 17 was a great mission, late launching and night launch. That anyway, but it was very late launching, and boy, those guys were tired, and we were tired in the control center, but we finally got it off, and But other than that, that mission was a jewel. It was really, really good.